What the Serbs need is a damn good thrashing.
This obviously explains why you're such a keen fan of German militarism.
Russia cannot tolerate it.
Yes, because what this story has missed so far is Montenegrin princesses. And they come in late, but they come in hard. The storm clouds of war are gathering.
If they do this, there will be a world inferno.
The states of Europe tethered together by a mountaineer's rope. Have a war! Crack on! Get Alsace-Lorraine back! Woohoo! Guffey had just arrived when the French squadron was signalled. The Tsar made me go up on the bridge with him. It was a magnificent spectacle. In a quivering silvery light, the France slowly surged forward over the turquoise and emerald waves, leaving a long white furrow behind her. Then she stopped majestically. The mighty warship which has brought the head of the French state is well worthy of her name. She was indeed France, coming to Russia. I felt my heart beating. For a few minutes there was a prodigious din in the harbour, the guns of the ships and the shore batteries firing, the crews cheering, the Marseillaise answering the Russian national anthem, the cheers of thousands of spectators who had come from St Petersburg on pleasure boats. At length the President of the Republic stepped on board the Alexandria. The Tsar received him at the gangway. So those were the recollections of Maurice Palaiolog, the improbably named French ambassador to St. Petersburg, who was remembering the arrival of the President of the French Republic, President Poincaré, on the 20th of July, 1914. And Dominic, up front, we'll be coming to Monsieur Palaiolog a bit later. But just to say, this is a golden age for comical French ambassadors, isn't it?
It is,
so there's the ambassador to St. Petersburg. The one to London is even better, and we'll be coming to him.
Paul Combon. Yeah,
it's absolutely brilliant. But this is, aside from the colour of the ambassador himself, this is a crucial moment in the story of the road to the outbreak of the First World War, isn't it? Because you have the Tsar and the President of the French Republic, two heads of state, allied either side of Germany, the western and the eastern flank respectively, meeting up in St. Petersburg.
Yes, and also, Tom, we ended last time with the Austrians preparing their ultimatum. The Austrians have been writing their ultimatum, but they have not yet delivered it. So they're waiting for the French to leave St. Petersburg before they will deliver it to Serbia. So they are meeting in ignorance of what they suspect something may be coming, but they don't really know what it is. And so that makes this meeting all the more kind of pregnant with possibility. So last time, in the last couple of episodes, we talked about Austria and Germany. Let's turn our attention now to their great antagonist, and we'll start with Russia. So Russia, Tsarist Russia, is the world's largest country, 164 million people, huge multi-ethnic, multicultural empire, including...
So
of course,
people compare it to the United States, don't they?
Yeah.
But it's a continental empire.
Exactly.
And just as America is rising, people talk of the rise of Russia.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Russia is exactly the right comparison. And those days, of course, Eastern Poland, Finland, Ukraine, they were all part of the Russian Empire. At the head, since 1894, the autocrat of all the Russias, Nicholas II. Of course, we all know what's going to happen to him in the Russian Revolution. He's a very conservative man, family man, nervous, stubborn, not terribly bright.
Looks like George V.
Yeah, looks just like George V, but sort of slightly more Charles I in personality.
Oh, yes, and indeed fate.
And in fate. And Russia has had a very tough beginning to the 20th century. They fought the Russo-Japanese War, in which they were utterly defeated. And then there was a little revolution. The Tsar was forced to call the Duma, a kind of parliament, which he didn't like doing. And ever since then, Russia has turned away. So all through the 19th century, Russia expanding in Asia, and its great rivalry with the British in Asia, the Great Game. But since the Russo-Japanese War, they've slightly turned back westward, and their focus has been on their alliance with France, which they signed in 1894, and the Balkans. And their eyes have been fixed on southeastern Europe. And really, the question is, why? Because the Balkans are quite a long way from Russia. Now, some people say, and you'll see this repeated often, it's because of their mystical pan-Slav solidarity.
And orthodoxy.
And
as
orthodoxy
well.
and all that sort of stuff. And there's
Slavs
a bit of
as
truth in
orthodox.
that, but I think only a bit. So it's the kind of thing that newspapers get very excited about. In the same way, I think, as British newspapers right now are talking about our kith and kin beyond the seas. You know, there's something slightly self-parodic, I think, about it.
Except that in Australia and Canada, they really are kith and kin. Whereas the relationship between the Serbs and the Russians is much more loose.
Yeah, exactly it is. You're absolutely right. I think another thing that people often talk about is maybe the Russians fancy, Russia is the third Rome. The second Rome is still standing, Constantinople, and it's part of a kind of decaying Ottoman Empire. You know, and there are quite a lot of Russian nationalists who think, I'd love to have Constantinople. You know, imagine that commanding position, but at the city of the Caesars. That would be.
But also, it's the strategic position of Constantinople that it's the kind of the chokehold of the Bosphorus that links the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and therefore to the world. I mean, that's the crucial thing, isn't it?
I think that's the important thing, actually, Tom. It's not whether or not they actually control Constantinople itself. It's whether they control the straits that lead from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Because in a nice sort of nod to events in the 2020s, Russia's economy depends upon Ukrainian grain exports. And the control of those straits is crucial to get those grain ships out of the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. And if the straits are closed off, then Russia's economy is in terrible trouble. And, you know, the Balkans are the hinterland to the straits. So it's very important, as the Russians see it, that no enemy power controls that hinterland and therefore, by extension, the straits themselves, because they could have basically hold the Russians to ransom over the grain exports, and they could stop the Russian Black Sea fleet getting into the Mediterranean.
And so it's a problem for the Russians, isn't it, that the Balkans are kind of in a mess. I mean, so Ottoman power has collapsed. We've been talking about this in our previous episodes about the assassination of the Archduke. And you have all these kind of nationalist seething resentments bubbling away. And that, I suppose you could either say, well, that's a real problem, or you could say it's a good place to fish.
Yes, exactly. I think it's both. So I think their fear for them is if the Austrians get hegemony in the Balkans or some other power. But the opportunity is they've got a rising. I mean, they had backed Bulgaria. Now they've switched horses and they're backing Serbia. Serbia, as we said, has doubled in size since the Balkan Wars. So the Russians, Serbia is their client. It hasn't all been plain sailing, though, because the Russians have twice, as they see it, had to give ground in the Balkans. Once, when Austria annexed Bosnia, and the Serbs are very cross about it, but the Serbs and the Russians backed down. And again, during the Balkan Wars, there had been a great hullabaloo about whether or not Serbia was going to get Albania and access to the Adriatic. The Russians and Austrians had been slightly daggers drawn about it. And again, Serbia and Russia had backed down. So the two sides there had drawn different lessons. The Austrians said, hey, listen, the Serbs and the Russians will always back down. And the Russians said, well, we've done it twice.
Yeah, never
and
again.
We can't afford to do it again. Yeah, so that is a big, big problem. And the other thing, of course, is that Russia is in a different place in 1914 than it was before then, because as we said in the last episode, Russia has been modernizing very fast. It has been spending huge amounts of money on its training its men, on armaments, and above all on its railways. So their army is now the biggest in the world. It's going to be 2 million people by the end of the 1910s, bigger than Germany and Austria put together. They are feeling much more self-confident than they were even 10 years earlier. But there is another thing, actually, and the guy called Dominic Leven has a book called Towards the Flame about Russia and the origins of the First World War, which is a brilliant book if people are interested in Russia. The Russians, like the Austrians and like the Germans, have this sort of ticking clock at the back of their heads. So in their case, the ticking clock is they are frightened, not that the Ottoman Empire will fall apart, but the Ottoman Empire will actually stage a bit of a comeback. The Ottomans have just ordered 2 dreadnoughts from a British firm, Armstrong and Vickers, and they've got 5 more to come further down the line.
And do the Russians have any dreadnoughts in the Black Sea?
They do not.
Right. So that is an issue.
When all those Ottoman ships arrive, the Russians will be outnumbered in the Black Sea 6-1. And their foreign minister, a guy called Sergei Sazonov, says to his colleagues, this will be absolutely calamitous for our ambitions. We cannot, he says, stand by and watch the expansion of the Ottoman navy, because that will torpedo forever our chance of getting getting control of the straits on which our economy depends. So that
and the
sense
Ottomans
of
could
urgency,
close the straits.
They could close
then.
the straits, exactly. That sense of urgency is really important for the Russians. So I mentioned Sergei Sazonov. He is a massive figure in this story. I guess a lot of listeners, he's not a household name by any means, but he's a really, really important figure, because he is the person who basically directs Russian policy in the whole of this story. And he is the foreign minister. He's been foreign minister since 1910. The caricature is always that they are kind of reactionary warmongers itching for conflict. In Sazonov's case, everyone says he's actually quite a decent chap.
He's very anti-German, isn't he?
He doesn't like the Germans.
And he's very pro-Serb.
Exactly, he is. He looks like a bank manager. He's got his short man. He's got his bald head, kind of beard.
That was the most dangerous kind.
Dominic Lieven says of him, one of the kindest and most decent men ever to serve as Russian foreign minister.
Well, let's be honest, that's not saying much.
Oh, I guess that's true. He's no Sergei Lavrov.
No.
He had the broad culture and polite manners of a well-educated European gentleman of the day. I mean, actually, I think by and large ambassadors do like Sazonov. They think he's a cultivated, civilized man. He's very highly strung. He's very nervous and so on. And his view of Balkan politics is, like everybody else really in this story, he thinks, you rise or you fall. Life is struggle. Some countries are doomed to fragmentation and disappearance from the map, and others are doomed to rise. Younger, more vital nations. And he thinks Austria is finished, and Serbia it's on a historical mission. He talks about its historical path, and one day it will reach its promised land in the territory of Austria-Hungary. That's how a lot of Russian writers think about Balkan politics. He almost thinks that basically the laws of history have doomed Austria-Hungary and indeed the Ottoman Empire, and it's kind of illegitimate for them to resist that. They should just step aside and let history take its course.
It's like a bison on the Great Plains in the 1870s.
Exactly. It's like one of our old friends, General Sherman or Sheridan, talking about the bison. Exactly that. And the comparison again between the Russians and the Americans, it's often been made about late 19th century, sort of these great expansionist empires. So when the Archduke is assassinated, Sazonov, Christopher Clark in his book The Sleepwalkers has a brilliant section on this, Sazonov and his documents to all his ambassadors. He within days constructs, and I don't think it's entirely contrived, I think he believes it, an alternative narrative about what happened that day. He says, listen, everybody hated Franz Ferdinand. So when the Austrians say they're really upset about it, that's nonsense. They don't give a damn about Franz Ferdinand. If there was a plot against Franz Ferdinand, it's only because everybody in Bosnia hates the Austrians. And that just shows what terrible people they are. The killers were Bosnian. I mean, to say it's because of Serbia is absurd and just a contrivance. It's just a pretext because the Austrians already wanted to strike Serbia. Austria has actually no right to just accuse Serbia willy-nilly and to take action against her. And ultimately, if the Austrians are making a great fuss about this, we all know why it is. They're just the sort of,
warmongers.
Yeah, they're just the Mozart-loving puppets of the strutting generals in Berlin, who are the people who are really pulling the strings. And
so he sees Germany as the real enemy, doesn't he?
He does, absolutely. He does. And as Chris Clark says, that interpretation of the events of the summer of 1914, it's not just very enduring, it's the interpretation that large numbers of people have right now. That there are people listening to this podcast who say, yes, Sazonov was right. That is what people think. That who cares about the Archduke? The Austrians, they didn't have any right to attack Serbia, and the Russians and the Germans were pulling in the strings anyway. So that's a narrative that you get right then and there, and it's constructed even before the ultimatum was issued. I think really important to make that point. So, the Russians, they start to hear whispers in the middle of July, before the ultimatum. They start to hear rumours that there was going to be an ultimatum. They've actually intercepted telegrams from the Italian embassy in St Petersburg that seem to show that the Austrians have started to put out feelers to the Italians to see, because the Italians are normally the Austrians' allies, to see whether the Italians are all right with this. So they kind of know this is happening, and Sazonov raises it with the Russian ambassador and says then and there, if they do this, there will be a world inferno. He says Russia cannot tolerate it if the Austrians get stuck in against Serbia. And of course, what makes this so ominous is that the Russians themselves have powerful allies. And this brings us on, Tom, to our old enemies, the French.
and allies, Dominic.
And allies, our beloved allies. Yeah, England's great friends, the French. So the French obviously have a lot of skin in the game, as it were, because the big thing for the French, France is a smaller country than Germany now. I mean, it's very conscious that it's a much smaller
Which is
country.
a real shock for it, because famously France in the 18th century was the
in
China of Europe, wasn't
Yeah.
it? And now its population has declined and its territory has declined because it's lost its Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. We talked about that.
I mean, it's a amazing thing, actually. For as long as France had ever existed, France had been the great powerhouse of Europe, hadn't it? Culturally, militarily, demographically. And suddenly, after 1870, the French are in the shade.
But I suppose culturally they still are.
But
Paris is the capital of Europe.
It is.
French remains the language of diplomacy. And
It
so
is,
on.
but when people publish these league, there's these league tables of kind of industrial production and all that kind of thing. It's Germany, not France, that is challenging Britain. And similarly, look at British politicians, British writers at the turn of the 20th century. Germany is kind of the up and coming cool place.
Yeah, but if you want to be, if you want to become a famous painter, you're not going.
But I don't, Tom.
You're going to Montmartre. Yeah,
but
I'm just saying.
My art teacher told my parents I was the single worst person she'd ever taught at art.
Well, this is obviously explains why you're such a keen fan of German militarism.
Yeah,
all stands revealed.
Clearly. Anyway, listen. The big trauma for France is obviously that Franco-Prussian War. Their Emperor Napoleon III, a ridiculous and terrible man, captured by the Germans.
Although he did meet my great-great-grandfather at his hotel on the Isle of Wight.
Did he? Did your great-great-grandfather say to him, how could you betray the Emperor Maximilian in France?
I don't know,
Mexico,
but I do think...
terrible way.
I have a soft spot for him as a result.
Okay, well, I don't. The German Empire had been proclaimed in Versailles. Alsace-Lorraine had been taken by the Germans. And there are tons of people in France in 1914 who are still very, very haunted by this, I think. So France, in reaction to this, had gone into alliance with the Russians. And actually, the Franco-Russian alliance is more than just a kind of diplomatic alliance. It's a cultural thing. I was really struck by the first... Have you ever had Russian salad?
I have. Yes, it's horrible.
It's terrible, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of chunks, lumps of stuff in a kind of mayonnaise, watery mayonnaise soup.
It's a terrible salad. So the first recipe for that was printed in 1894, which was the year of the alliance. It was dreamed up by a French chef.
So if you eat that, you're literally eating Franco-Russian imperialism.
And the fact is, there were postcards, there were cartoons, there were recipes, there was all this to celebrate this alliance, because it's basically two quite anxious powers who are frightened about Germany, and that alliance means a huge amount to them.
But, Dominic, also, just to ask, I mean, it is the most autocratic of autocratic monarchies, and it is really Europe's only significant republic.
Yeah.
A republic kind of founded on the execution of a king.
Yeah, crazy. So a sign, actually, that this is not really ideological. I mean, I always think this is a real problem for people who say the First World War was a noble crusade. Like, really? With Russia on your side? I mean, how do you explain? Anyway, President Poincaré, who you mentioned arriving in St Petersburg, he is from Lorraine. He is from a part of France that was dismembered and part of it taken by the German Empire. His hometown was occupied by the Germans when he was 10 years old. His family fled west. They did get it back eventually. But at 10 years old, you feel this, right? You're not 4, you're 10, and you notice it. And he said, in my years at school, I saw no other reason to live than the possibility of recovering our lost provinces. And when he becomes to dominate French politics, sort of Edwardian era, I think there is a sense in France that, we have basically been the whipping boy for too long. We've been licking our wounds. We've been tearing ourselves apart about the Dreyfus case, big espionage case, all this kind of thing. And actually enough of that now. Let's get back on our feet again. There was a book, Young People Today, published in 1913. War. That word has suddenly acquired a certain prestige, a young, new word, radiating the kind of attraction that an age-old warmongering instinct has revived in the hearts of men. Young people see all the beauty they long for, and all this kind of stuff about how brilliant war is, how France has always been a warlike nation. We should stop apologising.
So, Dominic, what you're saying is that actually it's France that's the militarist power, not Germany. Is that what you're saying?
I think they're both militarist powers, actually.
But
France
which
is
more
military.
militarist.
Well, Poincaré brought in a thing called the 3 Years' Law, which was 3 years of military service. And that raised French troop levels equivalent to those of Germany. But remember, Germany has a much bigger population.
So France is actually more militarised.
Per capita, France is the most militarised society in Western Europe. Now, listen, they're all relatively militarised societies, right? So I'm not saying that one thing is better than another, but I'm just making the point that the French, like their neighbours...
Yeah, I know. The legacy of your failure at art. Casting its shadow over
Hey, listen,
I am
Tom,
sticking up for
if
France.
you don't want to take it from me, would you take it from the Belgian ambassador,
Not
Baron
necessarily.
Guillaume?
The Belgians are notorious for their dislike
His name
of
is
France.
Guillaume. Is that not enough for you?
No.
He wrote back to Brussels and said, I'm really worried about the new mood in French politics. Nationalist, jingoistic and chauvinist, the greatest peril for peace in today's Europe. So that's a Belgian. I mean, I always listen to the Belgians. So for Poincaré, that alliance with Russia is incredibly important. And in his book, The Sleepwalkers, Christopher Clark describes at some length how the French are very worried that the Russians, as they're becoming more and more powerful and more industrialized, might one day decide that they don't need the French. I mean, that would be terrible for France. So rather like the Germans and the Austrians, who are sort of always they're so anxious about their ally that they're doing more and more to kind of appease them. The guiding principle of French policy is like, we bind ourselves to Russia, we lend them money for their railways, we do all this kind of thing. We never want to kind of let them out of our sight, as it were. And the French are very aware that if there is ever to be a war, they really need the Russians in on it. And so the best place for that war to start is the Balkans. So even before 1914, the French and the Russians have held talk, have explicitly discussed what would happen if there was a flashpoint in the Balkans. And they've said, we will get stuck in. We will not let you down. We will stand by you. That is the best place.
So do the French actively want a war?
Actively want a war.
Okay, I know the French covers a broad remit.
Yeah.
Does Poincaré, do the people around him, do they actively want a war? Are they looking for a casus belli?
I don't think they're actively looking for no, I don't think they are, but I think it's maybe not massively dissimilar from the German perspective, that they think, they know that there will one day be another war, and they want it to be on their terms and to win and to get back Alsace and Lorraine.
So again, it's aggression as a form of defence.
I think so, yes. They feel...
Although with the specific aim of getting back their territorial losses.
They are revanchist in a way that maybe some of these other empires aren't, because they feel that a part of France has been taken from them, and they're determined, someone like Poincaré is determined to get it back.
So do the French, the French High Command, look at what's happening in the Balkans and think, brilliant, this is our chance to get back Alsace-Lorraine?
I think to some degree they do. I think they think... Christopher Clark talks of a Balkan trigger. I think it's almost more of a Balkan tripwire would be there. They've constructed a tripwire across the Danube. And it's like, if Austria... They talk about this explicitly. And in the Balkan Wars of 1912, the French had said to the Russians, if you really want to get stuck in, you know where we are.
The thing I love about you've said how everyone behaves according to their national stereotype, is that when the Archduke is assassinated in Sarajevo, actually French public opinion barely pays any attention to it, because they're all obsessed by the most incredible sex scandal, aren't they?
They are. So a former prime minister called Joseph Caillou, his wife, Henriette, had burst into the offices of Le Figaro and shot the editor, shot him dead, because he had published letters from her husband's mistress. So the Caillou affair, a sort of...
what's best, so the trial is going on while the aftermath of... And she gets acquitted.
She does get acquitted,
on the grounds that this is perfectly reasonable behaviour.
Yeah, that she'd been humiliated by this editor, and therefore she had every right to shoot him dead. I know, and this drives the Franz Ferdinand off the front pages. So actually, this is an important point. In France, the kind of sense of sympathy... I mean, the French hate the Austrians anyway, don't they? We're going to be doing Marie Antoinette next month. I mean, the French have no time for the Austrians whatsoever. So there's really very little sympathy in France for Franz Ferdinand. There's far more sympathy in Britain than there is in France, because the Caillou trial drives it off the front pages. And insofar as the Paris press mentions the Balkans at all, it says, listen, first of all, it is a disgrace that the Viennese papers are stirring things up against Serbia. Poor Serbia, totally blameless.
Because Serbia has been a recipient of enormous French loans.
Yeah, French loans. And that the Austrian government would use this to make these cruel accusations against Belgrade. Disgraceful. So that is the context for Poincaré to go off to St Petersburg. And he doesn't go on his own. He goes on a boat, as we've described in that lovely reading, and he goes with the Prime Minister of France, who's just taken over, who's a guy called René Viviani. And Viviani, he's
not a warmonger, is he?
He's an anti-clerical socialist politician. He's always losing all his important papers, and he looks like, there's no other way of putting it, I'm afraid. He looks like a cross between Inspector Clouseau and the cafe proprietor René in the sitcom Allo Allo.
So again, conforming to stereotype.
Totally conforming to stereotype. So they arrive on the 20th and 21st of July in St. Petersburg. And right from the beginning, they take Poincaré takes a very hard line. So there's a big reception for ambassadors. And at that, Poincaré meets the Habsburg ambassador to St. Petersburg. Now, of course, he has an absolutely tremendous name. Count Frigyes Zapari de Sapar Murazombat et Sechisiget. I think we'll just call him Count Sapari.
Edward Habsburg, that's a much simpler name, isn't it?
And Poincaré
We're talking Hungarian ambassadors.
Poincaré says to this ambassador, "Yeah, I'm very sorry about Franz Ferdinand. What a terrible shame that was." And then says, "Are you thinking of forging documents to frame the Serbs? Is that what you're thinking of doing? Because don't even think about it." And the ambassador is really shocked by this. And then Poincaré says to him, "Let me remind you, Serbia has friends and they are watching." And the ambassador actually writes back to Vienna and says, I was really upset by this. I was really shocked that the president of France would be so tactless and insensitive and confrontational, when he's supposed to be offering his condolences.
And poor old Viviani he's getting more and more stressed by all this, isn't he? The kind of the warmongering of Poincaré.
He is.
He basically has a breakdown.
So the next day, the 22nd of July, he is seen lurking around. There's a big sort of marquee, and he's seen outside the marquee, and I
gibbering,
quote, muttering, grumbling, swearing loudly, and generally drawing attention to himself.
So a bit like Theo when we go over half an hour in the first half, which we've just done.
Theo, we've got 2 more pages, honestly. Just let us get there. So Viviani has his breakdown. Poincaré says to him, "Get a grip of yourself, man. Go and have the doctors see you." And I think historians generally think this is because he's seriously worried about the tone that
Poincaré
is adopted. And that evening, actually, it's just as well, because there's a banquet that evening, a military gala, And at that, there are these two Montenegrin princesses.
Yes, because what this story has missed so far is Montenegrin princesses. And they come in late, but they come in hard, don't they?
They do come in hard. So Montenegro, of course, very close to Serbia. Serbia's kind of sister kingdom in the Balkans. And these two Montenegrin princesses, they are married to sort of cousins of the Tsar. They're called Anastasia and Milica. And they are the kind of bells of the ball. And they are shouting at this banquet to Poincaré.
Have a war. Crack on. Get Alsace-Lorraine back. Woo-hoo.
There's going to be a war.
Brilliant.
There'll be nothing left of Austria. You're going to get back Alsace-Lorraine. We will meet in Berlin. And all this kind of thing. And a lot of people at this, French officials, not Poincaré himself, but a lot of French officials are quite perturbed by this. Yeah, it's embarrassing. Anyway, the summit has gone as well as Poincaré wanted. Basically, he's cemented the alliance with Russia. They've agreed, we will work really hard to bring Britain further and further, deeper into our alliance. We need to bind Britain to us. And this business in the Balkans, if it comes to anything, a hard line is the only way to deal with these Teutons. Go on, Tom.
Dominic, you say everything goes brilliantly, but there is one fly in the ointment, isn't there? Which is, terrible for a French president. That the dinner on board his ship, the France, is an absolute disaster.
It's shambles.
The soup course is late. The Russians don't like any of the court dishes. A huge embarrassment.
I think this is the Russian salad issue again, personally. I tried to track down the menu for this, and I couldn't find it. But there's no doubt in my mind they would have served that Russian salad, and nobody likes Russian salad. It's a terrible thing. It pours.
Do you think they would have tried to put a French spin on borscht?
They would have done
something like that.
Yeah, they'd have put a foie gras.
Is borscht Russian? I can't remember.
Borscht is Russian.
Yeah.
Borscht and foie gras is not a good mix. I wouldn't have said. Theo is a big fan of foie gras, actually. It pours the rain, and they have a marquee, and the marquee falls down. And Poincaré is absolutely furious. He also has another row with Viviani, who says because they need to publish basically a press release, a communique. And Viviani says the communique cannot be too hardline about the Balkans. And he ends up kind of slightly being overruled. Poincaré, basically, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know anything about foreign affairs. Shut up. So that night, the 23rd of July, they set sail back on their ship. Poincaré is like, great, we're on the same page, us and the Russians, and if whatever happens will happen, but we're pretty confident that if the Austrians do something, we will call their bluff and get them to back down, because only a fool would invite a world war against France and Russia combined. And of course, the one thing they have not considered is exactly the same thing that the Austrians have not considered, which is, what if the other side don't back down? What if your calculations are wrong? What happens next? And we'll find out, Tom, after the break.
We'll see you back then. Hello, welcome back to The Rest is History. And Dominic, I think it's fair to say that the doomsday clock is ticking down, isn't it?
Never have those storm
clouds of war are gathering, because even as the French president and poor old Viviani, who's been having breakdowns left, right and centre, are sailing out of Kronstadt harbour to go back to France. The Austrians have been getting their ultimatum ready.
Yeah.
And sure enough, on Thursday, the 23rd of July, the ultimatum is delivered to the Serbs.
It is, exactly. And so it's going to be delivered by the Austrian ambassador, as is the law with the Austrian diplomatic service. He has a splendid name. He is Vladimir Rudolf Karl Freiherr Giesel von Gieslingen. And he, at 6 o'clock, so it's at 6 o'clock because Poincaré and Viviani have left on their ship from Kronstadt. He's waited till they've left, and it's enough time so the Russians will struggle to communicate with the French ship. That's the whole point of their plan. So there's a slight another complication with the ultimatum. The Serbs are having an election campaign. So the Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, is away on the campaign trail. So when Giesel, the Austrian ambassador, turns up to deliver the ultimatum, the only person there is the finance minister, who's a very large man, chain-smoking man, very unhealthy, I think it's fair to say. And he doesn't speak any French, which is the language of diplomacy, so they have to drag in somebody to act as a translator. And when the the finance minister is given the ultimatum, he basically doesn't want to pick it up because he doesn't want to be tainted by it like it's radioactive. And Giesel says to him, don't hang around. There's a 48-hour deadline. And he says, we'll need much more time. We're in the middle of an election. And Giesel, slightly patronisingly, sort of says, do you not have railways? Do you not have telegraphs in this country? 48 hours is more than enough time. Because if you don't answer, I will sever diplomatic relations and leave Belgrade immediately. And then he sort of bows and goes out.
Clicks his heels, I hope.
Clicks his heels. I would like to think so. So the Serbian minister's still in the capital. They open the ultimatum and they finally seal this thing that the Austrians had been working on. So here is the ultimatum. It starts off by saying, for years you have tolerated societies and groups that have sponsored acts of terrorism, outrages and murders.
And they're not wrong.
Yeah, they're not wrong. They're not wrong at all. Our investigations, which of course have been continuing in Sarajevo all this time, our investigations have revealed that the men who carried out this murder were groomed, recruited in Belgrade, and they were helped over the border by your frontier service officials. Again,
not wrong.
Not wrong at all. And
but
actually,
they haven't tracked down the Black Hand, have they?
No, they haven't. This is the amazing thing, that at this point, the Austrians are pretty... They suspect that there are links to some of these kind of networks in Belgrade, but they haven't actually got that far. They don't actually know the half of it. They haven't got APIS, for example. They've got the mastermind behind the plot. So there were 10 demands in the ultimatum, and most of them we can deal with very quickly. They are things like, you must suppress such and such a nationalist group, such and such an ultra-nationalist periodical. Then they mention, you must act against these people in the army, these people on the border. They name that they have tracked down the 2 men who are most involved in grooming and recruiting and arming the gang. That is a guy, if you listen to the Sarajevo series, a guy called Major Tankasic and a guy called Milan Ciganovic. So the Austrians have them. They say, we know their names, you must act against these 2 men.
And Dominic, again, this is be very familiar to people who've lived through recent American wars. You know, demands to the Taliban that they surrender Osama bin Laden,
exactly.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's the obvious parallel will have struck a lot of people.
Yeah.
There are 2 really inflammatory points there in the ultimatum, points 5 and 6. Point 5 says, to suppress the subversive ultranationalist movements, you must accept our collaboration on your soil. So in other words, we will come and help you suppress these groups, whether you like it or not. And point 6, you must allow our investigators into Belgrade to take part in the investigations into the murder of Franz Ferdinand and Serbia.
And that is a direct assault on Serbian sovereignty.
It is. It absolutely is. Now, Winston Churchill said of this document, the most insolent document of its kind ever devised. Christopher Clark points out that actually it's not the most insolent such document in Serbian history, because NATO's ultimatum in 1999 over Kosovo was a much greater intrusion in Serbian sovereignty. The thing for Serbia is, of course, if they allowed in Austro-Hungarian investigators, those investigators would find
all kinds of things. I mean, imagine if they opened the briefcase of that bloke who's got the breast of the Queen in it.
Right, exactly.
I mean, what's this?
Exactly. There's a lot of stuff in basements.
A lot of dodgy stuff.
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, there's all these blokes who've been going and swearing oaths in front of skulls and stuff. Yeah. If the Austrians find all that, there's going to be hard to justify that in the Council of Europe, isn't it? I mean, so when the Serbians see this ultimatum, they're very shocked, and a lot of them are.
So they had not seen this coming.
Well, it's complicated. I think some of them suspected it was coming, but I think they kind of hoped. They pretended it wasn't coming. It's like you're waiting for bad news. And you
because
sort of tell
Passage,
yourself,
the prime minister, I mean, he's
Yeah.
clearly thrown into a funk, isn't he? Because he's out on the campaign trail and he suddenly announces he's going to have a holiday in Thessaloniki.
well, he doesn't announce. He says to, what is
just
it?
goes,
He's
"Let's
literally
off.
been on the
We're off."
campaign trail that day shaking hands.
Yeah.
And then he says to his, one of his aides or something, says, there's this ultimatum in Belgrade. He says, do you know what? Actually, I think
Let's
we
have a
should
break.
go.
Let's have a weekend break.
Yeah. And some people think he had a breakdown. Some people think it's that he
has form on this, doesn't he? Because he'd earlier when the king and queen were murdered, and hacked to pieces by all the assassins.
Yeah.
He'd scarpered off to the Adriatic coast.
He had.
So obviously his instinct in a crisis is to head off to a resort.
Go to a resort. I mean, why wouldn't you? So he's about to go to Thessaloniki, and basically his train has to be stopped, and a station master gives him a note from the regent, Alexander, that says, there's this ultimatum in Belgrade, you can't run away, you have to go back and deal with it. So he goes back, and at dawn the next day, Friday the 24th, remember, 48-hour timeline.
Yeah, so the clock really is ticking.
Genuinely the clock is ticking. He meets his cabinet at dawn on the Friday, so it's going to expire Saturday evening. On Friday morning, they meet, and they are all very, very anxious and dejected, is the eyewitness account. The plan is, well, we'll ask for more time, because that will give other people a chance to get stuck in, and, we'll play for time. But they know that the Austrians really won't give them more time. So what are they going to do? There are two schools of thought on this among historians. Thomas Otti, for example, says, the Serbians could never have accepted this note. The intrusion on their sovereignty was too great, and it would be disastrous for them, given they've got all the stuff hanging around in the basements or whatever. Chris Clark says, there's some evidence, actually, the Serbs, some of them were tempted to accept. A historian called Luigi Albertini interviewed a lot of the Serbian ministers and Serbian officials, and some of them said, at first our instinct was to just say, fine, accept every... Go on, Tom.
I mean, ultimately, it depends on whether Serbia can get support for its position against Austria, which basically means Russia. Because if Russia comes in behind them, then obviously that completely changes terms of their calculations.
It does indeed. And this is why I think any account of the origins of the First World War that doesn't give Russia a huge, huge part in this is missing something. Because everything depends now upon how Russia reacts. Now, just after the France has left St Petersburg, they get the news in Russia of the ultimatum. They have known that something is coming, so I don't think they are totally surprised because of their intelligence has warned them there is something on the way. But Sazonov, this foreign minister, looks like a bank manager, nice beard, very kind man by all accounts. He opens this and he says, "C'est la guerre européenne." It's a European war. And he rings the Tsar. It's the first time he'd ever used the Tsar. I believe one of the first times the Tsar had ever used a telephone. He rings the Tsar.
Really? So Sitting Bull was more familiar with the telephone than the Tsar
is. The Tsar would look down on the telephone as a democratic intrusion on the on Russia's traditions. And Sazonov says to the Tsar, "Oh, this is terrible. The Austrians are clearly itching for war." And actually, he blames the Germans, of course. They always see that Austria is merely a sort of a puppet of Germany, which is not quite right. The Tsar says, "I'm not sure about this because Vili, my cousin, is a lovely man, and I'm sure
they just had a summit, hadn't they?
Yeah,
I mean, not just a few months before, and got on tremendously well.
Yeah, and I think that the Tsar makes a good point, which is, he says Vili leads a country that no one likes the Germans, but they're very rich, they're very successful, everything's going well for them. Why would they risk everything with the World War? Mad. They don't want a world war." But Sazonov is adamant. He believes his own propaganda because he meets the Austrian ambassador and he says to him that day, "What are you doing? You're setting fire to Europe. This is all because the German papers have egged you on." That's not really true. They've not been egged on by the Germans. They've wanted to do it themselves. And then we can bring on Tom, the great person in this story that we've been looking forward to.
Yes. The second best French ambassador in this story, Maurice Palaiolog, and alert listeners with an interest in Byzantine history. may remember that the final ruling dynasty in Constantinople are the Paleologs. And Maurice Paleolog claims to be descended from them, doesn't he?
He does. I don't want to give the game away right away, but maybe I'll just go for it. I think Maurice Paleolog is a terrible person, Tom. He's like a man from a casting agency who supplied a ridiculous Frenchman. So
well, although he's the son of Greek and what is it, Romanian, Belgian? I can't remember. Belgian.
Yeah. That Greco-Belgian combination always so dangerous.
So in a way, he's kind of plus français que les français.
He is. He's exactly that. Yeah, he totally is.
He's maybe acting the Frenchman to a hilarious pitch.
He is. That's exactly what he's doing. He's a dandy. He's a womanizer. He's brought his own chefs from Paris.
He's also a novelist, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
So Sir George Buchanan, who's his British colleague in Russia, said of him, his vivid imagination is apt to run away with him and disposes him to take a fanciful and exaggerated view of political questions. And I would posit that in a highly combustible situation that might result in a European war, that's exactly the kind of man you want to be running the policy of a key participant.
Well, the thing is, you see, Poincaré and Viviani are at sea.
So it's all down to Paleolog.
So it's down to Paleolog to deal with the Russians, right? And Paleolog, as you said, he's a novelist, not just in the realm of sort of traditional fiction, but also in the realm of diplomacy. Because when he goes to meetings with the Tsar, he will often write the report on the meeting before he's gone to the meeting to send it home.
Well, it saves time, doesn't it?
Yeah, it saves time. It tells Paris what they want to hear.
It's like people who write up the football match
exactly
before the final whistle.
And the thing is, everybody has said in the French Foreign Ministry, Paleolog is a terrible man. Why would you give Paleolog this job? He's a complete loose cannon, And of course, the answer is, it's not just in Britain that this happens, Tom. I'm pleased to say he had been to school with Poincaré. So President Poincaré said, my old schoolmate Maurice Paleolog, quite a character. Eye for the ladies and loves a chef. And so had sent this bloke. So at this meeting, Sazonov and Paleolog. Sazonov says, what are we going to do? Paleolog just eggs him on and says, he never, ever, ever says to Sazonov, let's slow down a minute. We don't want a world war. He says, no, we must be hard on the Germans. The Germans and the Austrians are terrible people. We should take a hard line because the only line they understand. You stand up to a bully, and all this sort of stuff. So Sazonov is confirmed in his existing, he's been encouraged in his existing assumption, which is a hard line is the only possible line to take. And so that afternoon, he goes to an absolutely vital, crucial meeting of the Council of Ministers in Russia. And he says, listen, guys, we have appeased the Austrians and the Germans for too long. We have a historic mission in the Balkans. And if we back down now, we will lose all our prestige, all our authority forever. We will no longer be a great power.
Which is exactly what the Austrians are saying.
Of course. I know.
Both of them are saying exactly the same.
Yes, exactly.
This defensive aggression.
So the question for me, actually, that has often puzzled me about this story is why I can understand. I always understood why the Austrians cared. I mean, it's their heir that's been murdered, and they think it's their integrity of their empire that's at stake. What had always puzzled me was why the Russians cared. I mean, Serbia is a long way from Russia. And actually, it was only in the last few weeks while kind of reading about this that I kind of finally understood. The Russians care a lot about the Straits and access to the Straits because it's really, really important for them diplomatically and economically. They care a bit, I suppose, about Slav brotherhood and that sort of thing.
Orthodoxy and all that.
But the key thing is, from their perspective, they have backed down twice already in the last 5 or 6 years in the Balkans, over Bosnia, the annexation of Bosnia, and then in the Balkan Wars, about whether or not Serbia would be allowed to occupy Albania. And as they see it, the Austrians are just asking too much to ask them to back down 3 times in 5 years. So although I personally can completely understand why the Austrians acted as they did, it has to be said they are making a hell of an ask, as it were, by saying to the
big
Russians,
ask.
a big ask. It's a very big ask. It's basically saying to the Russians, yet again, you must concede to us on this.
And at a time when the Russians are worried about the Ottomans getting all their dreadnoughts.
Exactly.
And, will they be able to keep the straits open and all that?
Now, you might think, come on, can the two of them get together and sort this out? But you made this point, I think, Tom, in the last episode.
Yeah, they don't have email.
They can't talk on the phone. They don't have email, exactly. That everything has to be done through intermediaries like Maurice Paleolog, ambassadors.
And he's just making stuff up.
Yeah, ambassadors who will put their own spin on things, and there are allies. It's a real Chinese whispers. So it's hard for them actually to get together and talk about it, even if they wanted
to. And both sides are predicated to think the worst of the other.
Exactly, and both sides think time is running out. We are embattled. The others are malevolent and plotting against us. So
because the Russians actually overestimate Austrian military prowess, don't they?
Well, I mean, I think the Austrians overrate Austrian military prowess.
Right. I mean, the Russians, even though they have these massive forces and are relatively confident, they're still, they don't want to be caught out. They don't want to have a mobilizing empire on their doorstep.
Do you know, Tom, I was thinking about this in the break between recording these two episodes that we've recorded this morning. I was thinking about what made this different from Napoleonic Wars or something. And I guess part of it is that you can make a mistake and embark on, the 9 Years' War or the 7 Years' War or something. And what's going to happen? You'll lose Minorca or some, the results will not necessarily be apocalyptic for you if it goes against you. But one reason that they are all so frightened, I think, is because they know with industrialized total warfare, the stakes are so high. And that if you get this wrong, it's not, you'll lose a couple of provinces. If you get this wrong, you could lose everything. Your society could cease to exist. And I think that heightens the sense of urgency for them. You cannot allow your opponents to get a head start, outsmart
and so
you.
It's obvious that Austria is going to have to mobilize if it's going to have a crack at Serbia.
Yeah.
And Austria is a hostile power on your doorstep if you're Russian. So that then implies, well, we'd better start thinking about mobilization.
Especially because you are slow. If you're Russian, you are slow. You have the vast army. You have vast territory. You have to bring in people from a long distance. So that night, the 24th, 25th, they've sent a message to Serbia via the Serbian ambassador. They've said, you can't accept this ultimatum. That would be to commit suicide. We will stand by you. They've almost effectively given the Serbians a blank check of their own. You stand firm and we will see that, we'll sort this out for you. So the Serbians have their decision to make. The French are off at sea. But as you say, Tom, the big thing for the Russians is, do we get moving? Because we have to get cracking. If this is going to go horribly wrong, we can't mess around. So dawn breaks on the 25th of July. And of course, it's not a minor point. The Russians are deciding before everybody else. I mean, they're literally up before everybody else because of the time difference. So on Saturday, the 25th of July, they know that evening the decision will have been made because the Serbians will have probably rejected the ultimatum. And so they meet in a place called Krasnoye Selo, which is outside the capital. It's like one of the Tsar's summer palaces. He is there, Nicholas II. He's in a very fancy kind of white uniform of the Guards Hussars. It's a beautiful day. The French wind, it is that classic kind of
piano in the back.
Yeah. The French windows are open to the garden, and they're a very incongruous scene. And he's sitting around with his ministers. And Sazonov says, guys, we need to start mobilizing our troops now, because that's the only way that will make an impression on Austria-Hungary. And what we'll do is we will mobilize just a bit of them. So the 4 western military districts, that is Moscow, Kiev, Kazan, Odessa. So we will mobilize those. We'll cancel leave, reservists back to the training camps, put the railways on alert, all of this kind of stuff. It's not full general mobilization, and it's not a declaration of war or anything like it, but it's just getting stuff going, because that
will... It's a defensive measure.
It's a defensive measure, but also that will show the Austrians that we are serious, and that will mean that the Austrians say, okay, enough, we've gone too far, we will back down. Of course, this is an absolutely crucial point in the story, because at this moment, somebody is going to have to back down a long way. Either the Russians will have to call off their mobilization and send everybody back home again, or the Austrians will have to not go through with the ultimatum that they have long prepared. So the stakes are suddenly now very, very high now, and of course all the time.
A Russian mobilization also has knock-on effects for Germany.
It does indeed, because what are the Germans going to do? And all the time the clock is ticking, because at 6 o'clock this afternoon, Saturday the 25th of July, the Serbs will have to give their answer to the Austrian ultimatum. And as it happens, there are now just 7 days left before the World War begins.
Goodness. In our next episode, we will follow the course of those 7 days that leads to apocalypse. And patriotic listeners will be delighted to know that in our next episode, Britain will enter the story. So if you're not a member of the Rest is History Club, you'll be getting that in due course. If you are, you can get that straight away. And if you would like to join the club and get immediate access, you can go to therestishistory.com. But until then, à bientôt.
Bye-bye.
The discussion had reached its inconclusive end, and the cabinet was about to separate, when the quiet, grave tones of Sir Edward Grey's voice were heard, reading a document which had just been brought to him from the Foreign Office. It was the Austrian note to Serbia. We were all very tired, but gradually, as the phrases and sentences followed one another, impressions of a wholly different character began to form in my mind. This note was clearly an ultimatum, but it was an ultimatum such as had never been penned in modern times. As the reading proceeded, it seemed absolutely impossible that any state in the world could accept it, or that any acceptance, however abject, would satisfy the aggressor. The parishes of Fermanagh and Tyrone faded back into the mists and squalls of Ireland, and a strange light began immediately, but by perceptible gradations, to fall and to grow upon the map of Europe.
So that, Dominic, was Winston Churchill.
Of course.
Writing in The World Crisis, which is a book largely about himself, I think, isn't it?
It is indeed.
On the cabinet meeting held in London, the capital of the United Kingdom and of the British Empire, on the 24th of July 1914. And Churchill there is describing the moment that the British Foreign Secretary, and absolutely a personal hero of mine, Sir Edward Grey, reads the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia to his colleagues in the Liberal government. And people who heard our last episode, we ended with the world literally holding its breath. Literally, as it waited for Serbia's reply to this very, very kind of strict and stern Austrian ultimatum, and with the Russians and the French having pledged that they will hold firm against any sense of uppityness from Austria, and more particularly from Germany. But I think we've had far too much focus on continental powers so far,
right? And
I think it's excellent that at last we come to Britain.
At last, Tom. At last. So, hello everybody. Yes, we've kept Britain deliberately off stage, haven't we, so far? Because Britain was off stage. Actually, Britain hasn't really featured in the deliberations of the various powers, certainly not in the Austrian and German deliberations, and not really. The French and the Russians have talked about binding Britain more closely to them, but how Britain will react is still very ambiguous. And of course it really, really matters. Britain in 1914 has a much smaller population than it does now, so about 42 million people.
And that's even though it has Ireland.
Yes. But it's clearly the world's, it's the top nation still, just about. It's obviously was the world's first industrial nation, and it's still in the top 2 or 3 in most sort of indices. It has the world's largest empire, 400 million people, a quarter of the globe, and it has the world's greatest navy by far, but crucially, only a very, very small army. So although the British Army have fought battles in the previous decades, they have generally been against, Zulus, Boers, Afghans, Sudanese and so on.
But they have picked up khaki, haven't they, as a result of their wars against the Boers. And there's a sense in which actually the British probably have fought more wars than most continental powers.
They have, but they've been little wars. They've been police actions. They've involved quite small numbers of people.
Custer-esque operations.
Exactly, Custer-esque. Yeah. Now, Britain historically had alliances. So it's not quite right to say that Britain had always stood alone. So, the Napoleonic Wars, for example, Britain had been part of lots of different coalitions. And the way that British foreign policy had usually worked was that Britain relied on its navy. It had a small army, and it basically paid other people to do the fighting. So obviously, like the Prussians, for example, against Napoleon,
and in the 7 Years' War as well,
and in the 7 Years' War. But recently, Britain has had this policy of so-called splendid isolation. So Lord Salisbury, who was Prime Minister at the turn of the 20th century, said our policy was to float lazily downstream, putting out the occasional diplomatic boat hook.
Great days, Dominic.
Yeah.
Great days.
I like the sort of wind in the willows analogy for...
with a picnic hamper.
Exactly. But actually, round about the time of the Boer War, which didn't go terribly well for Britain at first, there was a sort of sense, well, actually, we've missed a trick here. We're fighting fires on lots of different fronts in the colonies, and we don't really have any friends. So Joseph Chamberlain, Colonial Secretary, had said, we have no allies. I'm afraid we have no friends. We stand alone. And he had wanted an alliance with Germany and had got no joy out of it. So in the end, Britain had signed or agreed the Entente Cordiale with France in 1904.
Which is a seismic change, isn't it?
A massive change.
Because we've said how previously, basically all these wars are being fought against France, and Britain's continental ally is Prussia, a German state. And now it's kind of veering around the other way. And
now Britain has switched horses.
But Dominic, is that because Britain has a sense that you should always ally with a lesser power against the most threatening power on the continent?
I think.
And is there a sense now that Germany has become what France used to be?
I think
so the roles have switched.
I think that's a huge part of it. That Britain has always wanted to ensure that the continent is not dominated by a single power. So it makes sense that you ally with somebody a tier down, as it were, against the kind of the top power on the continent. But also, as with the subsequent convention that we signed with Russia in 1907, there is an argument among a lot of historians that actually what these are Britain looking at the map and looking at where the big flashpoints are and saying, we will ally with those countries with whom we are most likely to have friction, to basically dampen down the friction on our colonial frontiers. So with France, for example, there had been a war scare as recently as 1898 in the Sudan, the so-called Fashoda, or Fashoda, I don't know how you pronounce it actually, because I've never been and never spoken to any Sudanese person about this incident. So this is a mystery to me. Anyway.
Well, if we have any Sudanese listeners, let us know.
Yeah. So Kitchener and a French guy had basically marched from different directions, arrived at this place. The French had been completely outnumbered and had been slightly humiliated. It was a big deal, and they want to avoid that happening again. And of course, they really want to avoid it with Russia. So, for example, in his book, The Sleepwalkers, great historian Christopher Clark, Regius Professor at Cambridge, he says, in a way, you could argue it's a kind of appeasement, that Russia is a big threat to our empire in Asia. We've had a great game with Russia. And this is
India, isn't it? The jewel in the crown.
Yeah.
The fear that Russian forces will push down into India.
Right. That this is a great way of managing that. That if you actually sign an alliance with them, then, that's fine. India is protected. Same with France in Africa or Southeast Asia or wherever it might be. And actually, the Foreign Office bigwigs say this quite explicitly. There's a guy called Charles Harding in 1909, and he writes a memo in which he says, well, why are we allied with Russia? which doesn't seem a natural fit for us at all, rather than say Germany, which a lot of people think would be a natural fit. Great ties of kind of the royal families, culture. At this point, the late 19th, early 20th century, there's all this stuff about kind of racial kindred, kith and kin, all of that kind of stuff.
So Saxons.
Saxons, exactly.
Yeah.
And Sir Charles Harding says it's because we don't really have any issues with Germany. The only one is the naval race, which we are winning. But he says our whole future in Asia is bound up with maintaining the best and most friendly relations with Russia. And the bigger and more powerful that Russia becomes, the more it industrializes, the more railways they build, all of that stuff, the more that people in the Foreign Office say, look, we absolutely have to keep the Russians on side. So Harding's successor, who's a guy called Sir Arthur Nicholson, he's very explicit about this. He says it is much more disadvantageous to us to have an unfriendly France and Russia than to have an unfriendly Germany.
And so what that implies is that the empire is actually a bit of a millstone, that it is kind of pulling British foreign policy off courses that it would otherwise be taking.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? That the protection, that the sole priority really is the protection of the empire, and because of the protection of the empire, we have had to ally with people that maybe is a tiny bit distasteful. I mean, certainly with Russia. So remember, this is a liberal government, so there are lots of kind of do-gooders in this government, and they look at Russia and they say, "Really, Russia? Yeah, the most autocratic country in Europe, Germany." Science, high culture,
social democracy,
big trade unions, all that. Really, we're going with the Russians? And the Foreign Office people say, hey, we've got to be realistic. It's all about protecting the empire. This is what makes most sense. So that
doesn't necessarily translate into anti-German feeling, does it? And yet, as we've often talked on this podcast, there is a kind of anti-German mood abroad in England that time. There are all those kind of books about the Battle of the Dorking Gap, and
yes,
when William came, kind of scare stories about a kind of telling slip there, a German conquest of Britain.
Yes, especially after the Franco-Prussian. Well, actually, uniquely after the Franco-Prussian War. So those hadn't existed really before. But after Germany is created in 1870, then you're absolutely right, Tom. You get this sort of growing anxiety about Germany, and it really, really starts to kick in, I think, round about the very late end of the 1890s. The Boer War, we're fighting Boers who are not so dissimilar from Germans, but also
the Germans. I mean, the Kaiser famously sends supportive telegrams.
He does. The Kaiser, and in fact, lots of Germans, and frankly, lots of other people around the world say the plucky Boer underdogs and these bullying shopkeeper, the British
with the butcher's apron.
Exactly. So there's a lot of stuff about that. There are all those, as you said. I mean, I love all that invasion scare stuff. It'd be a brilliant subject actually for a podcast. Really whipped up by the Northcliffe newspapers. So my old stamping grounds, the Daily Mail, very prominent in that
because they basically they would publish scare stories in places where their circulation was low.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what they did was the key battles took place in places where they had lots of readers, because to terrify, Watford sacked by the Prussians or whatever. And then the other thing is the naval race. So once the German Empire is established, and then once it's sort of got going, they decide they'd like a fleet. A fleet is seen in the 1890s as really the supreme badge. It's like having nuclear weapons or something. This is your ticket to the top table. The British are very offended by this. They start building dreadnoughts, and this creates a lot of antagonism. But actually, Britain wins that naval race hands down. By 1913, the Germans have unilaterally declared it's over, we can't compete, we're not going to carry on building dreadnoughts at the same rate. Fine, have your naval advantage. So that actually means that as you get to 1914, the temperature is a little bit lower than it had been.
Yeah, so we already mentioned it, that trip to Berlin by Haldane.
Yeah, the war minister.
The war minister, to try and kind of form a German equivalent of the Entente Cordiale. I mean, it fails, but presumably it's a sign that actually relations between them are thawing.
Yes, I think so.
Are actually can be quite. I mean, because on the kind of personal level, there are lots of people in the British upper classes who are very, very keen on Germany to a degree that is not comparable today.
No,
people have been massively influenced by German culture for an entire century, going back to the time of Coleridge, George Eliot, all those kind of intellectuals, hugely influenced by Germany in a way that would be inconceivable today.
I mean, I think you could reasonably argue that if there was a point in modern British history when people were most keen on Germany and German culture, it was actually in the 1900s and 1910s.
Yeah, it's so ironic, isn't it?
And it went both ways. So the man who had masterminded the naval race for the Germans, Grand Admiral Tirpitz, he had an English governess for his daughters, and then he sent his daughters to Cheltenham Ladies' College because he wanted them to have an English education. And then there are a lot of people. So even in that cabinet, in that meeting that you described so beautifully with your Churchill voice, Sir John Simon, who's one of the Liberal cabinet ministers, he had said publicly, the fellow countrymen of Shakespeare and Milton cannot look askance on the fellow countrymen of Goethe and Schiller, and those with the tradition of Wycliffe and Wesley have no ground of quarrel with the descendants of Luther.
Yeah.
So
there's the famous German joke about Shakespeare, isn't it? That the English translation of Shakespeare isn't bad.
Yeah. Well, the Germans absolutely adore and look up to British high culture. There's no question about that. So you have that. Now, you do have people in the Foreign Office who are very down on Germany, and we'll get into one of them a little bit later in the story. But Christopher Clark talks about this in The Sleepwalkers. He says there's a steady stream of memos and minutes arguing about the threat posed by Berlin. And he has a lovely analogy, which I think could be developed even further. He says all of these people, they read those kind of Edwardian stories in which there's a new boy at the school who, he's maybe a bit vulgar and he doesn't know the...
New money.
Yeah, new money. He comes from new money and he's a bit of a braggart and he's a blusterer, and the older boys should sort of punish him and tame him.
Yeah.
And
he's not familiar with the traditional rules of the school.
And this is, he says, this is how Foreign Office mandarins talked about Germany. And of course, this, by the way, is how Kaiser Wilhelm's relatives talk about him.
Well, the Kaiser undoubtedly has a feeling that he's being treated a bit like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The new boy who's not being made to feel welcome in the dorm.
And of course, what gives that an extra charge is that Germany's doing so well. So that Germany, by the outbreak of the First World War, has overtaken Britain in industrial production. It is right behind Britain in its share of world trade. People are aware of these figures. They have a real sense of it. And they see people make jokes in the early 20th century about products that are stamped made in Germany. And they find that, as unsettling as Americans did in the 1980s and 1990s when it was made in Japan or something. So that's on...
So kind of what the Americans would call the Thucydides trap.
Yes. Oh, the Thucydides trap, exactly. The rising power must, by definition, challenge...
But do you think that's right? Do you think that it's inevitable that... for instance, Britain would go. Britain would see Germany as an enemy rather than as a potential ally.
No, I don't.
Because the implication of what you're saying is that that's not the case at all.
I don't think it is inevitable. I think we've already mentioned two different, very, very influential British politicians, Joseph Chamberlain and Richard Haldane, huge figures in their day, not maybe household names today, but huge figures in the 1890s, 1900s, who really, really wanted an alliance with Germany. And I think the general sense, certainly by 1914, is, we've had spats and arguments and things, but actually things are now getting much better. So Arthur Nicholson, who's running the Foreign Office, the top civil servant, says, the Germans have been making great efforts to be on the best possible terms with us. And, to some extent they've succeeded. David Lloyd George, the Chancellor, gave an interview on New Year's Day 1914 to the Daily News, and he said, our relations with Germany are infinitely more friendly now than they have been for years. And I think if you had said to people at that point, now there'd be some people who believed that point that you make the Thucydides trap, some people in the Foreign Office who would say, realistically, Germany is going to challenge us, and we should gird our loins for that. But
right, which is exactly like the German attitude to Russia.
Yeah.
That we should sooner, better.
But it is much less charged in Britain and much less paranoid.
Well, also because Britain in 1914, we know this because we did a series on the Easter Rising. that Britain in 1914 is pretty inward-looking because it's racked by all kinds of crises, of which the Irish debate over Home Rule is the major one. But you've got the suffragettes, haven't you?
Yeah,
You've got strikes.
Yeah, labour unrest.
So the sense we tend to have of it being a kind of golden summer bank holiday, suddenly that turns to mud and rain, isn't entirely true.
No.
There are crises everywhere. And I always remember that incredible comment that Asquith makes to the effect that, he says, well, at least the war will distract us from, the horrors of potential civil war in Ireland.
Exactly. Yeah, the very day after Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo, Sir Henry Wilson from the British Army told Asquith, he said, we're going to have to send the entire army to Ireland to deal with the consequences of Home Rule. So the British do not have their eyes on the Balkans at all at this point. Of course, the Sarajevo assassinations were extensively reported in Britain. The Times ran 7 different stories on the assassinations the next day.
And the tone is sympathetic.
Totally sympathetic. I mean, they're all, gosh, the poor old emperor, Franz Joseph, he's endured so many trials, the death of his wife, the death of his son.
And Franz Ferdinand and Sophie had been visitors in Britain just the year before, hadn't they?
And everyone said they were such tremendous people. And had actually liked them. So Buckingham Palace is in mourning. There's a big service of remembrance at Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral, and quite a lot of the cabinet went to that service to express their condolences. So there's that side. There's a natural sympathy, and then there's a sense, well, it's actually not that big a deal, in the grand scheme of things. So there's a very famous Guardian.
The Guardian kicks in with very prescient editorial.
Yeah. The murders will have no immediate or salient effect on the politics of Europe. Not the last time the Guardian would comically misjudge world affairs, I think is fair to say, Tom. And in fact, in the Foreign Office, the general sense is this will blow over. This will not be a massive deal. Now, the one person who is worried straight away, you've already described him and said he is a great hero of yours, is the Foreign Secretary, the man who basically runs foreign policy as a private fiefdom and has done for a decade, and that is Sir Edward Grey. So,
tremendous man.
Tom, you love Sir Edward Grey, and what is it about him that appeals to you?
He is the embodiment of a certain languid superiority that I would dearly like to possess.
That you associate with yourself.
No, I don't, but I aspire to it. So Sir Edward Grey remains to this day an absolutely fated fly fisherman. His book on fly fishing is very, very highly regarded. And you'll know that I'm in the process of trying to take it up.
Yeah.
And I'd like to give a big shout out to Jeff, who I know is a regular listener, who's doing his best to teach me. So thank you, Jeff, for all your struggles. And basically, when I stand there trying to cast a fly, if I think of that it's me who's doing it, it all goes wrong. I get the hook in my finger, or
right.
The line gets tangled in a tree, or I spear a duck or something. But if I imagine myself to be Sir Edward Grey, in fact, I have a Sir Edward Grey hat which I wear.
You're going to wear it now?
So people who are watching this on YouTube, I'm now going to put it on, and it's absolutely brilliant.
Oh, it's a wonderful hat.
I got it from Sir Edward Grey's outfitter, so it's exactly the same one. And I imagine myself as Sir Edward Grey in the summer of 1914 casting, and then I can do it perfectly.
Wow. There's a lesson.
So I think that's the measure of the man.
There's a lesson for all aspiring fishermen there. So Sir Edward Grey came from a Whig family.
You say that. I mean, he doesn't just come from a Whig family.
No,
it's
one of the
dynasty, isn't it?
Whig
so
dynasty.
He's the great grandnephew of the Earl Grey who introduces the Great Reform Act in 1832. But much more significantly, and the reason why he's remembered, gives his name to the eponymous tea.
Is that named after the Earl?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I've never really.
Yeah.
I'm not a massive fan of. I don't like a scented tea. I like
it's very liberal, isn't it?
Yeah, it's too liberal. So Edward Grey, highborn, goes to Winchester College, one of the great schools that we talked about in the Real Hogwarts podcasts. Then he went to Balliol College, Oxford, like his great friend Herbert Henry Asquith. And
indeed you, Dominic.
And indeed me, yes. And unlike me, he had a life of pure pleasure. I was a bookworm, Tom, I'm sorry to say, but
he didn't you play football for Balliol?
I did.
Grey played football for Balliol.
Did he? Probably at a higher level than I did, Tom.
Yeah, maybe. But I mean,
there's yet another resonance with this podcast, right?
Yeah.
So, so he was actually sent down, which I wasn't. He was sent down for not doing any work. The college minute book said he'd been admonished for idleness and shown himself entirely ignorant of the work set for him in the vacation. So that's bad form.
But that doesn't stop him
No.
becoming
Liberal
MP.
For Berwick.
A place very close to my heart. Berwick,
Yeah.
where I have my Scottish estate.
Yeah.
So, it has excellent fishing, obviously, on the Tweed.
Yes.
And also a lot of squirrels.
That's nice.
A lot of red squirrels. So we've seen red squirrels up near our Scottish estate.
Right. This is really spiralling off now, this story
I know,
of the First World War.
But so his base is North Northumbria, a place called Falladon.
Yes.
He's so devoted to squirrels that Lloyd George suggested that if the Germans invaded and were marching on
Yes, I
on the
remember
north
that.
on the northeast, then he could be made to yield by a German captain who threatened to exterminate the squirrels around his house at Falladon.
Well, so he's
I really like that.
He spends a lot of time in these country pursuits, I think partly because his private life is a bit of a mess. Well, not a mess, it's just a bit of a wasteland. So he married a young woman called Dorothy from a big Northumberland landowning family. They went on honeymoon, and Dorothy said to him at the end of the honeymoon, I actually find the physical side of marriage repulsive, which is, no one wants to hear that. You don't want to hear that from your new bride. And they never that side of the marriage was then dead. And his biographer Thomas Otte says he took up competitive real tennis with greater energy.
Well, that's the solution.
So
royal tennis is the one where you have a kind of very heavy ball, don't you?
Very
And
heavy
it's
ball.
kind of modelled on a medieval monastery.
It's quite
or something.
dangerous. So,
But he's really good at it.
brilliant.
I think he got a blue. I think he was.
Yeah,
the
I
kind
think he
of-
was exceptionally good. And he
and
played
he won all
squash and all these kinds of things.
Yeah, he won all kinds of national championships.
Yeah. So
That's
he's
very
so he's
admirable.
doing that, and he spends all his weekends fly fishing and stuff. And in fact, somebody at the Foreign Office said he basically never goes. He's never been abroad, or hardly ever. He doesn't speak any
French. That's
doesn't
it.
speak a word of any foreign languages. It would be advisable for him to spare some time from his ducks to learn French. But Gray obviously thinks it's not suitable for a Balliol man to do that kind of thing. So
I just love the idea of him. Of a weekend. Friday evening, he gets on the train, goes down and fishes.
yeah, but he does it in a
That
very
for me is a kind of image, a certain. I mean, basically, that's how I like to imagine the Edwardian period.
Yeah.
And I know all about strikes and Ireland and everything, but that the image of a man in tweed with a hat fly fishing on a lazy June afternoon.
having just spent the day settling the affairs of Montenegro. Or
All that
whatever.
kind of
yeah,
thing.
or whatever he's been doing.
Yeah.
But the thing
The
is,
world we have lost, Dominic.
he fishes in a very melancholy way, Tom. Dorothy died in 1906 in a riding accident. And Gray, he always reminds me of Thomas Hardy in this regard, who obviously is living at the same time. Thomas Hardy, when he lost his first wife, wrote all these sort of poems saying, I feel so, we didn't really get on and I feel so guilty. The clouds have gathered and all this kind of thing. And Gray absolutely... He is ravaged by a sort of strange guilt after her death. So he would have tea laid in her room when he was in your neck of the woods in Northumberland, and he would just sit there silently on his own, staring at the tea set. And he said to people, "I wish I could be dead. I wish I could join her in death. The worst
I
state
also
of
like
all."
that melancholy strain.
Yeah, well, that's very Edwardian. The worst state of all is to feel dead and to have to go on being alive. That is my difficulty now. And then his brother is killed by a lion in Africa. Again,
It's very imperial.
very Edwardian. And then he starts to lose his sight. And for a man who basically spends all his time playing real tennis and spotting
and bird watching.
birdwatching.
There's a wonderful photo of him wearing his fisherman's hat with a robin on top of it.
Yes, yeah.
And another one, he's sitting on a bench surrounded by ducks.
Yeah.
He's a very proficient birdwatcher.
Now, all of this makes him sound, probably, especially to our overseas listeners, if a sort of muscular Australian listener to The Rest is History, this will confirm all their stereotypes of the English, right? This sort of languid, useless, don't speak a word of the foreign language, just interested in bird watching. But actually, he's a very serious politician. He is what's called a liberal imperialist. So there was him, there was Haldane, and there was their friend Asquith, who was the sort of the alpha male of the three. And they're liberals, so they believe in being kind to people and using the power of the state. But they believe in smiting the boors and being carrying a big stick abroad and all that
Slightly,
sort of thing.
faintly Blairite.
Yeah, a little bit. I can absolutely see that. So Grey took over the Foreign Office at the end of 1905, and he was there for 11 years. And he ran it. It was his domain. He's in charge of Britain's foreign policy. Nobody, I think, has ever run it for as long as he did. Certainly not in modern history. Some of the Liberal MPs say, I don't like the way he just does it all secretively, and he doesn't. And actually, it's not very liberal. So they're kind of ethical foreign policy people.
Yeah.
And they say, why are we pally with the Tsar? Why are we pally with chummy with the world, Europe's most autocratic monarchy, with, people being dragged off to prison in Siberia and stuff.
And as you've said, it's realpolitik.
Yeah, exactly.
It's to protect the empire.
And they don't like that. Now, the other thing is, nobody really knows what Grey has agreed with some of these foreign countries. So the classic example of that is France. We have had the Entente Cordiale since 1904, something that is still, people are still quite sentimental about, aren't they? Whenever, the British Prime Minister goes to visit Macron, they will make reference to the Entente Cordiale, how brilliant it is. But actually, when you dig it out and you look at what it was actually all about fishing rights in Newfoundland. And
about Edward VII going to Paris and hanging out with
there's
courtesans.
that, but actually the text of the stuff. Of course, Edward VII is going around and smiling at his old mistresses and stuff and waving to the crowds in Paris. But the details of it, they're all about the ownership of towns in Senegal. They're very, very...
So there is no public, written, stated agreement between France and Britain about what they would do in the event of a German attack on France, or indeed a German attack on Britain.
And here is the crucial thing, right? So in public, people are always asking Grey this. Are we in an alliance with France and Russia that will require us to fight on their side if there was ever a continental war? And he says, absolutely not. There's nothing. We can do whatever we like. We don't have to get involved. But in private, when the French ask him, he says to them, we'll always stand with you, Of course. Now, there's a fatal ambiguity there, because in 1914, the top Mandarin, Sir Arthur Nicholson, said to him, you have promised their ambassador, Monsieur Cambon, that if Germany is ever the aggressor, you will stand by France. And Grey gives them the ultimate Edwardian British response. He says, yes, but he has nothing in writing.
Love that.
I imagine Roger Moore would give that line very, very nicely.
Ray arching his eyebrow.
Which is the perfidious Albion. So there is a real uncertainty about what Britain will do. Nobody outside Grey's office can be sure. In fact, I'm not even sure that he really knows himself what he would do if it came to the crunch, and what Britain will do. I guess we'll have to find out after the break.
We will find out. Hello, welcome back to The Rest is History, and in this part we're looking at basically how Sir Edward Grey and the British government respond to the assassination in Sarajevo and the gathering war clouds of the July crisis. But it's also an episode that will feature two absolutely top ambassadors, isn't it, Dominic?
We like
two of my favourite ambassadors in the whole of history.
Wow.
And the first of these is the German ambassador, Karl Max, Prince Lichnowsky, who is genuinely, I think, a very admirable man.
Oh, he's
Sir Edward Grey meets with him on the 6th of July. But Lichnowsky, wonderful guy, great wife. So he's from Bohemia.
Yeah. He's from Silesia. He's Silesian.
Sorry, he's from Silesia. His wife, Mechtilda, is from Bohemia. And she's very, very glamorous. And their house, which is on Carlton House Terrace, becomes a kind of great centre for, all kinds of British luminaries go there. So Kipling goes there, and Shaw, and members of the Bloomsbury Group.
Yeah.
And he has excellent coats. He's great. I love him.
He's very famous for his parties, isn't he? So he's one of the richest men in Germany. He's a very suave aristocrat. He loves Britain. Everybody in high society in London says, oh, he's a jolly good fellow. Prince Lichnowsky, they're wonderful people. Now, actually, the problem that I think he has, and that actually Britain has, and Germany has, in this crisis, is he loves Britain rather too much. and he hates conflict. He's actually quite a sort of nervous person, bit behind the sort of the debonair, behind the kind of debonair urbanity.
So he loves Britain and he hates conflict. Again, he's like me.
Right, very good. All these people seem to turn out to be like you.
The Kaiser.
Yeah, yes.
So Edward Grey.
Extraordinary. It's like being
It's
being in your troubled psyche, different versions of yourself. So, I mean, Thomas Otte makes this point in his book July Crisis, that Prince Lichnowsky has a habit of telling Sir Edward Grey what he wants, what they both want to believe, as in, things will all be fine. We'll be able to sort this out.
Yeah.
No one
It'll all
wants...
be fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't worry.
So on the 6th of July, Lichnowsky says to Grey, this is the first time they've discussed it, so it's now over a week since the assassination. Lichnowsky says, the Austrians are planning something, and I do not know what it is. And Grey, interestingly, says, well, we have to be careful not for the conflict to spread. But, he says, listen, I can understand they would be planning something, because it's kind of unreasonable to expect them not to react at all to the heir to their throne being murdered. And that is Grey's position for quite a long time, that he's not quite like the French or the Russians. He's not, as it were, stubbornly anti-Austrian. He wants to manage this. Let's get through this. We can sort this out.
And when it becomes apparent that various great powers are starting to square off over it, he sees Britain's role as a kind of mediating one, doesn't he?
He completely does, yes. So there are some historians who say, right from the beginning, he should have said, oh, well, if there is a conflict, Britain will back France and Russia, so you, Germany and Austria should stand down because you don't want to be fighting us. And they say, well, what a fool Grey was. Why didn't he do that? That would have deterred them. And the reason he doesn't do that is actually is completely understandable. He thinks somebody piling in like a bull in the china shop, kind of Kaiser style, with sort of threats and menaces, is the last thing you need. What you need is somebody to say, we will be the honest broker. We will mediate. But, we're not going to pick a side. We won't threaten the Germans. We will work with them. They will probably be the people we end up working with to calm all this down.
But I suppose the problem with that is that Britain does have an entente cordiale with France. It is in a kind of an alliance with Russia.
Yeah.
And Austria presumably would not be part of this because Austria and Serbia are the two who have to be, the mediation has to operate. So that means that Germany essentially is outnumbered 3-1.
Yeah. Oh, I
would feel that it's outnumbered 3-1.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right.
Because Britain actually isn't an honest broker in this. I mean, it has skin in the game, really.
This is the ambiguity of Grey's position, because actually Grey is also meeting other ambassadors. For example, he meets the Russian ambassador, Count von Benkendorf. Everybody has the wrong name.
Yeah.
Lichnowsky and Benkendorf should have swapped surnames. Bizarrely, or not bizarrely, given how Edwardian diplomatic politics works, Benkendorf, the Russian ambassador, and Lichnowsky, the German ambassador, are cousins. So,
of course they are.
So he meets him and he says to him, well, let's what we should perhaps do is reassure the Germans. Together, we don't want the Germans to be too isolated. We want to reassure them. He still thinks, I think Grey thinks, the Russians, the French, the Germans, indeed the Austrians, they're all solid chaps. They can all be brought to see sense. Of course there are differences between them, but just with if I show myself to be a man of good faith, they will all agree to some sort of mediation. And as you said, Tom, that's slightly missing the point that he's already promised the Russians, the French anyway, he's promised the French that when it comes to the crunch, he will be on their side. So they can kind of ignore him if they want. They don't have to go with his kind of mediation proposals. So right up to the point when the Austrians issue their ultimatum, he is still pretty sympathetic to Austria. So the 22nd of July, he meets the Austrian ambassador. Like all Austrian ambassadors, he has an enormous name. Count Albert Victor Julius Joseph Michael Graf von Mensdorf Puili Dietrichstein. We call him Count.
Crazy name, crazy guy.
Count Mensdorf. And Mensdorf reports to Vienna, he says, Grey is not without sympathy for us. Grey is he's very cool, he's very friendly. He is worried about what will happen. And actually the ambassador says to Vienna, I am anxious that when Grey sees our ultimatum, he will be really shocked.
And he is, isn't he?
And he is. So that meeting that you described in your Churchill voice, Tom,
Yeah.
24th of July, Grey reads that out to his cabinet colleagues, and he says, this is the most formidable declaration I've ever seen addressed by one state to another. And they all say, well, the one thing we don't want to do is to get involved in a world war. They're absolutely adamant about that. And they say to him, the thing to do is you go to the Germans and you go to the French, and the three of you together should be able to persuade the Austrians and the Russians not to fall out about this. Now, of course, what that completely misses, they do not realise how committed the decision makers in Paris and Berlin already are to their respective...
So it's a failure of intelligence.
I think
and
it is a little bit.
Of what we've talked about throughout these episodes, that senior ministers in the chancelleries of the great powers are operating blind to a degree that would seem incomprehensible to us.
Exactly. It's amazing to me that until such a late stage, Grey, perhaps misled actually by some of those ambassadors in London who have gone a bit native, he doesn't get that actually the partners for his various mediation proposals just don't actually exist.
But there is, of course, an ambassador in London who has not gone native, and that is the French ambassador, Paul Cambon, who we've already mentioned, who has been in London since 1898 as ambassador.
16 years.
But just as Grey does not speak a word of French, Paul Cambon does not speak a word of English. What? Despite having been in the country for 16 years. And I hugely admire that. That is what I want from a French ambassador.
I mean, the amazing thing, I can't remember where I've got this from, but this quote, I think it's from Chris Clark.
It is. He's very funny about Cambon.
Cambon insisted that every single utterance be translated into French, including easily recognised words such as yes.
Yeah.
So when Grey said to him, would say yes, this little man at the side would say, oui.
And also his opposition to there being French schools set up in England on the grounds that French people who grow up in England are mentally retarded.
Yes. Can you think of anybody, Tom? Can you think of anybody, a Frenchman who went to a school in England and has possibly, there are question marks about his acumen and maybe his life choices.
I can't think of any such person.
Poor old Theo. Theo is so long suffering.
And also the weird thing is that Cambon's brother Jules is the ambassador to Germany.
I know.
So again, it's all in the kind of family affair, isn't it?
It is. So they met, Grey and Cambon, after that cabinet meeting on the 24th of July, and Grey said, "Look, so I've dreamed up a solution to this crisis, and it's a 4-power mediation. So there'll be 4 mediators. There'll be Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, and between us, we can sort this out." Now, there are massive problems with this idea that Grey doesn't realise. Number one is France and Germany don't even want to do it, really. They're not signed up to the idea of mediation because they are both already signed up to the idea of calling your opponent's bluff and not backing down and being firm and all that business. But also, that lineup that he's described would inevitably vote 3-1 against Austria because Britain and France are kind of allies with Russia and Serbia. Germany, obviously, with Austria, and Italy, nominally with Germany and Austria, but actually hates the Austrians.
Yeah.
So that is a problem. Grey doesn't realise it, of course.
And neither does Asquith, does he?
No.
Because on the 24th of July, the same day that Grey is talking to Cambon, Asquith is writing in his journal, we are within measurable or imaginable distance of real Armageddon, and the we there is Europe.
Yeah.
Happily, there seems to be no reason why we, meaning Britain, should be anything more than spectators.
Yes. So just on Asquith, a great friend of the rest is history, much loved prime ministerial figure, much maligned, I think, by some people at Goalhanger, Tom, very, very cruelly. So Asquith, famously the kind of incarnation of the effortless superiority of the Balliol man. Asquith, we know a lot about what he's thinking during this period because he's slightly letting himself down, isn't he? By he's got a bit of a crush on his daughter's best friend. So his daughter's Violet, and her best friend is called Venetia Stanley. She's 26 years old. Asquith is 62. So it's arguably it's not. I'm not defending it, Tom.
It is what it
is. It
is.
is what it is. So he's sending her all these love letters, and he will often write to her. I mean, he actually writes to her during cabinet meetings, which I think is probably not ideal.
You can't imagine Theresa May doing that.
No, absolutely not. There is one recent prime minister I can imagine doing that,
Yes.
but let's not bring him into it. So he says to Venetia that evening, Russia's trying to drag us. I'm worried that Russia's trying to drag us into the war. And he actually then goes on to say, and I think this absolutely captures the British attitude. Asquith says, the curious thing is that on many, if not most of the points, Austria has a good and Serbia a very bad case. But the Austrians are quite the stupidest people in Europe. And there is a brutality of their mode of procedure which will make most people think it's a case of a big power wantonly bullying a little one. And another point, actually, he writes to her and he says, what the Serbs need is a damn good thrashing. You know, that's sort of, so the British are not Serbophile by any means, and they're not Austrophobic. But all they want to do is they want to see Serbia get a bit of a slap on the wrist from the Austrians, so the Austrians are happy, and then it all calm down and they can go back to their fishing. And he can play bridge and think about Venetia Stanley. That's basically Asquith's dream scenario. And Gray's too, actually. I mean, Gray,
He goes
unbelievably,
off fishing, doesn't he?
He actually goes fishing the next day.
Yeah,
You would
tremendous
think
behaviour.
this is the day, the 25th of July, Saturday, Tom, that the ultimatum expires. And Gray, who you might expect to stay at least in London, says, no, I'm going to go fishing. And actually, he goes off to his country cottage, which is on the river Itchen.
It is.
And
Beautiful. I've seen it.
Well, this is where the most controversial person in this whole story makes his appearance, right? Because not only have you seen it,
Yeah.
you went there with the fox-murdering anti-Brexit lawyer Jolyon Maugham.
He's a charming man.
Well, I don't want you to lose.
I went there with Fergal Sharkey.
I don't want to lose all our listeners or our British listeners.
So Fergal Sharkey, who's Undertones lead singer, but is also now campaigning basically against poo being dumped in our beloved rivers.
Yeah, sewage.
And,
Sewage is his
sewage
thing.
and stuff. And we walked the Itchen.
Yeah.
And he brought Jolyon Maugham, who was delightful.
Really?
Yeah, I liked him very much.
Oh, my word, Tom.
But Dominic, I like everyone.
You do.
I like
So
everyone.
listeners who are... I mean, to our overseas listeners, this is just mad babble. But, but British listeners can make their own minds up, as they can about other controversial characters such as the Kaiser and other such people. Right. This is all a massive red herring. Meanwhile, the Germans are thinking about Gray's mediation proposal. So that has got back to the Kaiser, the ambassador's reporter. The Kaiser does not like it at all. The Kaiser scribbles on it, on the piece of paper. He says it's useless, it's nonsense, it's a complete waste of time. And he says, why would we betray our one friend in Europe, Austria, who we've promised that we would back? Why would we suddenly say, well, actually, I think we should all have a bit of a mediation? You know, it's that classic thing of, I don't know, it's people who've fallen out and one friend says, I'll stand by you no matter what. Never give in to those miscreants down the road or whatever. And then the next day says, actually, I was thinking I might organise a meeting in a cafe and we can all talk. You'd be like, what, you're on my side or not? That's what the Kaiser's view. The Kaiser thinks you can't do that to your friend.
I think you're revealing details about your school days here, Dominic.
Really? I'm a hold firm man, Tom. What could possibly go wrong? What's the worst that could happen?
Just a shame that your hand wasn't on the tiller of the ship of state. in
Exactly.
1914.
Well, I wouldn't be off fishing, that's for sure, like some people.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be fishing with fox-murdering lawyers, like some members
To be
of the-
fair, Sir Edward Grey wasn't either.
No. Well, he wasn't. He was on his own, wasn't he? Melancholy, thinking about his wife and real tennis.
And birds.
So the Germans at this point were on the Saturday. The Germans still do not think that there will be a world war. And we know this, we can be pretty certain, because people in the Foreign Office are giving off-the-record interviews to Berlin newspapers. Gottlieb van Jagoff, who is the foreign minister, is talking to the editor of the Berliner Tageblatt, and he is saying, maybe war will come one day with Russia, and we must be firm, but it probably won't be today. His political director says the same thing. The Russians, they'll just shout loudly, and hot days will follow, but that will be it. And if you're going to be critical of the Germans, as a lot of historians are, you would say at this point they are just being willfully reckless and self-deluding. That again, it's the intelligence failure. They just don't understand how seriously the Russians are taking all this. Now, there are some people, particularly, I mean, there are people in the Foreign Office in London, some of Gray's mandarins, who are a little bit more hard-nosed about this. And the classic example of this is a man, an absolutely bizarre man, called, he has a ridiculous name, actually, what would you even call him, Tom? Sir Crow?
Yeah, Sir Crow.
Yeah. Now, he is the chief Germanophobe at the British Foreign Office.
Despite basically being German.
Despite being German himself, which is bonkers.
It's also confusing, isn't it?
So he was born in Leipzig, educated in Dusseldorf and Berlin. He first came to Britain when he was 17 to cram for the Foreign Office exam, and he spoke with a German accent. But one of his parents was British, which is how he qualified. And he is fanatically anti-German. And you've got to believe there's some strange psychological stuff going. He's more British than the British.
Complex or something.
Yeah, exactly. And he has been saying since 1907, Germany is a bully and a brat. It's the new boy. It's the bullying boy at school. And bullies only respect strength. And whenever we...
It's reminiscent of Kipling's poem on Danegeld, isn't it?
Yes.
That, you mustn't pay it, or
you'll never get rid of the Dane.
Yeah. You never pay anyone Danegeld.
Yes, exactly. And he writes, so this weekend, Saturday the 25th of July, he writes a memo to Gray that you will see cited in every single book about this, because it really does sum up the dilemma for Britain. He says, if there's a war, he thinks there will be a war, because he says, I think the Germans really do want to take over the world because he hates Germany so much. And he says, if we stay out of this war, there are two alternatives. Number one is the Germans and the Austrians win. And in that case, they will dominate Europe. They will dominate the Channel ports, all of that kind of thing. And we will be left, our allies would have been crushed, and we'll be left alone and friendless at the mercy of the Prussians. That's number one. And he says number two is, the other possibility, probably less likely, the French and the Russians win. And he says, what would they make of us then? Because they would have won without us, and they would despise us for not having helped them. And then they would turn on us. They would drive us out of the Mediterranean. They would drive us out of India. We would lose everything. And so Crow says to Gray, stop deluding yourself about your mediation and all that rubbish. We should get stuck in. We have no choice. Our own policy has left us. The logic of our policy has left us. There is no debate to be had. We should get cracking on fighting, which is obviously not what Gray wants to do. But
so presumably Gray is hoping that the Serbs will maybe back down, and that the whole crisis will go away.
Yeah, maybe, or that they will react and they will respond to the ultimatum in such a way that there'll be a fudge. Maybe. Yeah. I think it's an element of wishful thinking about it. Now, actually, let's move the focus back to Serbia. So Saturday is the day the ultimatum expires. What have they been up to? First of all, they've been making some limited military preparations. They've put the army in charge of their railways. They've started to bomb some of the bridges over the rivers.
Let's just remind people, Belgrade is right on the it's next to the river that constitutes the frontier with Austria-Hungarian Empire.
So they've started to bomb the bridges on there's two rivers, actually, because the border was so different in those days, that affected the frontier, the Danube and the River Sava. So they are making preparations there. All day they've been working on a reply to the ultimatum. It's one of the most famous diplomatic documents in history, and it is covered with crossings out and scribbles because they keep changing their mind about what exactly to say, and they're in a terrible panic. They've got the typewriter is jammed, so they're having to adjust it by hand. It's all a total shambles. One of the key men who's drafting the reply is the trade minister, who's called Velizar Jankovic. And on his mind all that day is the fact that, this tells you everything, I guess, about that kind of globalized pre-1914 world. His wife and children are on holiday in Austria-Hungary. They're on the Adriatic coast. They're in Croatia. So many people go to Croatia every year. Well, they're there.
Because it's famous, this is an age where you don't need passports.
Yeah, you can just...
Unless you're going to Russia.
Right,
you
exactly.
Can go anywhere.
Exactly. So, and if you're in Serbia, the Dalmatian coast is exactly where you would go, sunning yourself in Dubrovnik or whatever.
Yeah.
And he says, oh my God, if the ultimatum expires and war comes, they will be trapped. And he decides, this is an amazing story. He decides, I'll have to go to the German ambassador ask him for help to get my family out. And he says to his coachman, take me to the German embassy. But in the general air of panic, and of course Austria is on everybody's minds, the coachman goes to the wrong embassy. So he arrives at the Austrian embassy at 5 o'clock. The ultimatum expires at 6. So the Austrian ambassador is waiting for a Serbian visitor.
So he assumes this guy has come with.
Yeah, Yankovic gets out and he's like, "Oh, they've sent the trade minister." That's and this the Yankovic. There's a terrible realization he's come to the wrong place, and the Austrian ambassador is right there by the carriage saying, "Please step inside." So he steps in and then he says, "Actually, I haven't come to. I've actually come about a very embarrassing and awkward situation." And he explains, if our countries are at war, my wife and children are on the wrong side of the border.
Well, he's basically giving away what the Serbs are going to do by saying
exactly.
that, isn't he?
And Baron Giesel responds splendidly. He says, again, I think the voice you're looking for here is an Austrian Roger Moore or sort of George Sanders.
Sound of Music thingy.
Christopher Plummer.
Christopher Plummer in The Sound of Music.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly. He says, it will be my pleasure as a gentleman to see to it that your family have special passports to take them to Venice, and our government will give them 10 gold Napoleons so they are not out of pocket. Yeah. And they shake hands.
Do you know, Dominic, I know that this is the most disastrous failure of diplomacy in global history.
Yeah.
But weirdly, I think diplomats are coming out very well from this story.
Well, they're making a lot of mistakes. I think it's fair to say.
But they're all
tremendous fellows.
Chaps.
Yeah, you'd love to have a dinner party with them, wouldn't you? Baron
really
Giesel,
would.
Prince Lichnowsky, all these characters. Probably not the French guy because you wouldn't. I don't want to see his translator. And his disobliging views about Theo's education, very disappointing.
No, Theo's mental health.
Yes. So as Yankovic leaves, he can see. It occurs to him. The Baron is in his travelling clothes. He's wearing +4s. The place is. Everything is packed up, ready to go, ready for war. And he realises, there is no way the Austrians are not going to fight. And indeed, with 5 minutes to go until the deadline, 5:55, the Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic, arrives at the Austrian legation. Giesel shows him into the study, and Pasic says, part of your demands we have accepted. For the rest, we place our hope in the loyalty and chivalry of an Austrian general. And he gives him the reply to the note. And to cut a long story short, the reply to the note, it's often misconstrued. People say the Serbs accepted all the demands except the most inflammatory, number 6. That's actually not right.
And that's the one that where the Habsburgs demand the right to join the investigation on Serbian soil.
But that's not right. They accepted all the demands in theory, but not in practice. So
with
actually,
caveats.
There were always caveats. They said, well, we don't think this nationalist organisation even exists, but if you can prove it exists, we'll help you to shut it down. Or they say, yes, we will do this insofar as it is commensurate with international law. So when Giesel looks at the document, he says, he wrote later, nearly all our demands were twisted, robbed of their meaning and purpose, and their fulfilment, if not directly refused, was so hedged in reservations that it was in practice useless. And all diplomatic historians, by the way, this isn't an anti-Serbian thing, all diplomatic historians have said it was a brilliantly, brilliantly written reply that basically gave the Austrians, seemed to give them almost everything, but in reality gave them absolutely nothing. And Giesel reads it and he says, fine, it's absolutely clear. He said, I had nothing to weigh, nothing to decide. All there was to do was to leave. So he burns the ciphers. He literally locks the embassy and gives the key to the Germans. Please look after the embassy. And then he goes to the station. And you were saying about diplomats, Tom. All the other diplomats, all the other ambassadors have assembled at the station to see him off, waving their top hats and stuff, except for the Russians, and I suppose you'd say understandably, the French. I think they could have tried. And the Romanians, who were trying to get into bed with the Russians and the French. I think they could have made a showing as well. I think that was poor.
Well, I'm afraid that reflects badly on all three.
All three, exactly. And you were saying how close it is. It took him 10 minutes to get the train and then to cross the border, cross the bridge into Austrian territory. That's how close they are. And as the news reaches Vienna very quickly, of course, and there are huge crowds outside the War Ministry. There are people singing patriotic songs. They're singing this famous anthem about their capture, the siege of Belgrade in 1717. They're waving flags, great crowds of students. We should sacrifice everything for our emperor. all of that kind of tremendous. There is genuine excitement in Austria.
And this is what gives people the sense that everyone greeted the war with great enthusiasm.
But of course,
it's kind of surface.
It's surface. And of course, don't forget, the Austrians think they're only fighting Serbia. I mean, as it happens, their campaign in Serbia was a total disaster. But it's a slightly different issue, a small Balkan war. And they're not celebrating a world war. They're celebrating revenge for their Archduke, as they see it. However, there is one person who doesn't react in quite that way. The Emperor, Franz Joseph, is in Bad Ischl on the lakeside at his summer house with Count Berchtold, the foreign minister. And they're waiting for the news. And an aide comes in to tell Franz Joseph the news and says the ultimatum has expired, relations have been severed, whatever. And Franz Joseph just is totally quiet and still, and he just says, "Also doch." Well then, there it is.
And there it is. And the states of Europe, tethered together by a mountaineer's rope, are getting ready to vanish over the precipice into the abyss, Dominic, of war. So if you want to follow that, we have 2 more episodes of this series to go. And they'll be out in due course. But if you want to hear them straight away, you can, of course, get those last 2 episodes right now by joining the Rest is History Club at therestishistory.com or accessing it immediately if you're already a member of the Rest is History Club. But either way, we'll be back with the final 2 episodes in the series very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.